Moffatt.
Let's say some city land somewhere in the GTA becomes available and it's, big enough to build 100 homes or something like that. A builder buys the land, sells the homes. Who pays for the infrastructure costs? Like if there's putting in a sewers, lights, roads, potentially a school, like who has to pay for that?
Well, that's largely the developer through a system called development charges. Now, different jurisdictions do it differently, so I'm taking an Ontario centric approach here. But in Ontario, we have this system of development charges, which are flat rates for single detached homes and apartments and things like that. There are a lot of other charges as well. I think the average Ontario development has about 9 to 10 different charges assessed to it. But it basically works through this system of development charges, which is relatively new, that we've only had it for about 35 years or so.
How did things get built before that then?
Well, it was more of a kind of a negotiation where cities would sort of figure out what stuff would cost, and or the developers themselves would do these things. But so you had a system that had a whole lot of negotiation, and it got changed to this kind of flat rate approach where again you have this kind of fee schedule and go, okay, if you're building a single detached home in Ottawa, the development charge is roughly about $40,000.
I wanted to read a question directly from our producer because I think she put it beautifully, which is why is it important that anyone know anything about development charges at all? And so I just want to throw that to you.
Well, I think it's out of sheer interest, right? Because to the end home buyer or even resident, that these are just buried into costs, right? They're kind of a hidden cost and hidden part of the development system. But I think it's important to understand. What it does to home prices, but also how it affects how infrastructure is paid for, both the capital side of it. So, how do you actually build the roads and the sidewalks and the water treatment plants in the first place? But then how do you actually pay for them over time because they need to be repaired? There's upkeep costs and so on. So I think it is important that we do understand how our cities work, even though that this can get kind of wonky and trivial at times.
Yeah, definitely. I remember the first time hearing in a story development charges, and I was like, I know nothing about that, and it just doesn't sound interesting. But then I started hearing about it as like, okay, so if a new home's being built, if there's an additional cost, then the developer is going to pass that on to the buyer, which means that effectively new homeowners or people buying new homes, it seems like that they are subsidizing people who already own homes, or at least people who are buying resale homes. And when I started thinking of it like that, like, oh, are there is it the younger generation subsidizing the older generation? Is that what's happening here? That made me kind of look more into it, and I wanted to know more about it, which is where it becomes interesting in some ways, because I see some people making the argument that it doesn't affect home prices at all. This is just, we charge the developer, they're going to charge what they can charge anyways. They're not going to pass it along because like they're already charging the maximum they possibly can. What do you think? Does it actually increase the price of homes? Is it taxing the younger slash new buyers, but tend to be the younger generation for the older generation?
Yeah, that they are essentially passing this on. And in some cases, I think where this gets more pernicious is that sometimes it just doesn't make sense because to build at that point, because what can happen is even if you take that viewpoint that developers charge the maximum they can, which I think makes sense. Well, sometimes the maximum they can charge doesn't cover the cost of construction and those development charges and things like that. And that's where the challenge becomes, that this isn't just about making stuff more expensive. It's also to the point where it just makes stuff unviable. That the developers have this term that things need to pencil in the sense that they need to the numbers need to add up, and that's one of the big challenges here. That this isn't just these costs being passed along, but it's actually stifling home building and home construction.
Do we know if it actually is doing that?
Yeah, at a certain level, it is absolutely. And one of the other things that it causes is because development charges are different in different cities because they cover different costs and different things like that. it can also change where development happens. So, if development charges are lower in rural communities near a London, let's say London, then that incentivizes that building to happen in London, in Lucan or one of these smaller communities instead of London, which ends up being bad overall, because you have people moving outside of the city who work and shop inside the city. So it can lead to sprawl. It can lead to people having long commutes and things like that. So it absolutely does change the amount of development that happens, but also where development happens, and when done poorly, contributes to sprawl.
The best argument I've heard that's like in favor of development charges uh, being being there is that the people who are living there in the neighborhoods, like they didn't need the extra infrastructure. It's needed often. I guess there's repairs, but it's often needed just to because there's a new people coming in there, and if new people are coming in there, they need more infrastructure. So then why should people who are have been living without that extra infrastructure just fine have to pay for it? They should have to pay for themselves. That's usually the most common argument, and in some ways it's a good argument because it seems like exactly how it sounds, right? Like if it's new people causing it, why should I have to pay more for someone else's? But at the same time, I think that there's probably an argument to say that new people coming to a neighborhood does improve it. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. So I think, and that's the idea here. So the sort of phrasing that urban planners and others use is that growth should pay for growth. So if you've got a bunch of new stuff, then new housing and new population growth and that kind of thing, then they should be the ones that pay for it. And there is a certain logic to it. I'm not going to suggest there isn't, but there's also some problems to it. So one is that it's hard to really divide out what is growth-based infrastructure and what is stuff that happens. So let's say you've got a town with a water treatment plant that's 80 years old, and then you add a bunch of people to that, and you go, okay, you know what? This old water treatment plant isn't meeting the needs of the community anymore. We're going to have to build a new one. Well, is that because of growth, or is that because the water treatment plant was 80 years old, right? So it's not as neat and clean as people say.
Right
But
now, is it clean in that like does growth actually pay for growth right now?
well, it both does and doesn't, and that's one of the big challenges here. That the way we've set up development charges has tended to encourage sprawl, right? So a development charge, for instance, doesn't, generally speaking, distinguish between where the new home is getting built. So I keep using this idea of tearing down my house, which I'm really not planning on doing, but let's suppose I do. Um, if I tear down my house and to build a new one on the lot, I still have to pay a development charge, even though that the infrastructure is already there, right? Or if I build a home closer to a bunch of existing homes, the infrastructure lift is fairly low. But if I build one kind of out in the middle of nowhere, I still pay the same infrastructure charge, but the actual cost to the city can be enormous. So there's this real sort of disconnect, and how our development charge system works tends to charge not nearly enough to kind of suburban development, and then tends to overprice like urban infill. So it's not really the case that any one particular development is paying for their additional costs. Some are paying more, and some are paying less.
The Doug Ford government announced that I guess it was about a year ago now, that they were going to cut development charges on certain kinds of builds that they were hoping to incentivize, ones that were below market, that they have affordable but also attainable, which is, I'm not 100% sure on the definition that's being used there, but they decided to cut it on the ones that they wanted to see built. And I wonder, do we know that if those charges are cut, that the savings will be passed on to the consumer, or does it just mean that those are more likely to be built?
I think the intent is more the latter, right? That it's not about reducing prices. It's about increasing supply. Like if what you were trying to do was put more money into first time home buyers' pockets, you could just give first time home buyers more money and let them go that way. That would be a cleaner and neater approach. it's basically the idea of it is to increase supply, but it's kind of a problem what the province did, right? Because the development charges don't go to the province; they go to the municipalities. So it would be like, let's say I'm the premier and you're the mayor. It'll be like saying, me saying, oh, I'm going to cut the price on this thing, and Cara's going to pay for it, right? And which is not a fantastic thing to do. The premier kept saying that he would make municipalities whole, like they would find some way to compensate cities for that, but they hadn't really done that. They haven't really explained how that's going to happen. So it's been a bit of a mess, to be to be quite honest. Along with defining exactly what it means for something to be affordable or not affordable in order to get the development charge waiver.
Do we know what portion of the high prices right now of housing in Ontario is because of development charges?
Yeah, I haven't seen any great data on this. That we know, for instance, that the sort of charges overall can be up to about 30% of home prices. But that's not just development charges. That's things like land transfer and taxes and so on and like that. But again, I think this bigger issue is more that it's slowing development. It's causing development to be less than what it otherwise would be, which again is problematic in our big cities with high development charges. Because I'll ask you, what happens to a city where all the sort of 30 somethings end up getting priced out, right? That's not a great thing for the sort of resiliency of a city. And I imagine you're someone who lives in Toronto. I think you're technically a millennial. I mean, I'm sure you've seen a lot of your friends basically get sort of priced out of the city and have to move somewhere else.
Yeah, I was described as losing friends to the suburbs. It's very
Yeah,
sad.
and by the suburb, and we should be clear about when we talk about it, it used to be when you lost friends to the suburb, they moved to like Etobicoke
Oh
or
no, I have
somewhere,
like
right?
one of my friends moved to like Angus and is commuting to downtown Toronto. Like there's it's and there's probably, I can think of another one that moved to St. Catharines, some people who moved to uh anywhere really like very far from Toronto, and that would not work if they had to come in every day. It just wouldn't work.
Well, I was going to say, so I would imagine the St. Catharines folks are not either not working in Toronto or at least not coming
They
in
are
very
working in
often.
Toronto, but not
Yeah.
on a regular basis. Like they only have to come in every so often. In that case, it's a couple friend where one of them is working in St. Catharines, the other one is commuting to Toronto every so often. And so, if they had to come in every day, that would be a problem, though. And I think that it would not be sustainable. But I do know that there are people I know who do commute on a regular basis, at least a couple times a week, from there, and it's really really far, as we've talked about before. Like that idea of the drive to qualify. Well, if that's where they qualified, that's where they're going to go, right?
Absolutely. So I want to kind of dig into this a little bit. So we've got kind of two folks that the first are kind of driving till they qualify and then driving back into the city. So let's go to the question. Okay, well, why should existing homeowners care for that? Why did these development charges pricing people out? Like, why does it affect existing homeowners? Well, there's the first reason, right? That all those folks are driving back in, clogging up the roads, and those folks living in Angus are not paying a dime of municipal property taxes to the city of Toronto, even though they're using Toronto's infrastructure. So that means higher taxes, higher property taxes for those homeowners because you're pricing out those middle class folks.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's the
Yeah.
people who you're saying that it's then people in Toronto if they cut development charges here. Well, I guess if they're cutting
Yep.
development charges in another place, it's not really helping. It's still going to cost people here in the form of having to pay for the infrastructure for them to come in.
Yeah.
Which I guess
Well,
goes to
well,
the whole toll road question of whether the highway should be tolled in order to recoup some of that. I don't know if there's any other. Like, I guess the question is there only a way? Is it only property taxes or development charges? Are there other ways to recoup the costs?
Well, yeah, I mean, we could with toll roads and things like that, but I think the larger point is that these things aren't as zero sum as we kind of think. Like, oh, well, this is a development charge, and we could think of this being a good or bad thing for developers or first time home buyers, but it doesn't really affect existing residents. And I'd
Mm.
argue it does, right? Because if you're pricing people out of your city who are then driving back into the city, that's a whole lot of traffic and congestion. And all of those folks are using the local infrastructure and not paying for it. And I think that affects existing homeowners. Next
Interesting.
question is, like what, I don't want to get too personal here, but I will. Like, what your friend, like what kind of jobs do they have, particularly the ones that, let's say they're moving to St. Catharines and working in St. Catharines,
Well,
like
there's
like what are
one of them is someone who works at a actually works at TVO, and they have to come in. He has to come in twice a week on average. Like he I keep wondering whether he'd still work there if they made him come in 5 days a week. I don't know. Like if that would be too difficult because right now twice a week seems doable. It's
yeah.
it's 2 hours each way or something like that.
Right, so you've got you got the commuting folks, and but it sounded like at least some of your friends just decided moved out of Toronto and now no longer work in Toronto.
Yeah,
And that's the other reason I think existing homeowners should care about this, because you could think it's like, okay, I'm an existing homeowner, I've lived in Toronto 45 years, why do I care about development charges? And I'm like, do you like having a doctor or nurse? If you do, you probably should care what's happening to development charges, and you should probably care that you are pricing the middle class out of your city. Because if no nurses or personal support workers or therapists can afford to live anywhere near the city of Toronto, you're going to have a big healthcare shortage. And you're seeing that the folks working out, moving, some are going to work at colleges, some are somewhat ironically, the very tradespeople that we need to build the homes in Toronto are leaving Toronto because there's no homes for them in Toronto, right? So it's
there was
this,
a vet in my own
yeah,
neighborhood in Midtown Toronto that ended up moving out and closing it down because they said that they could not afford to live in Toronto anywhere near it. And I thought, if a vet is having a hard time, like a vet's not a low paying job, it's not a super high paying job. I don't think, but it's not a low income job. Like that should be that they should be able to afford something that's really bad.
well, that's just it. And right now, to qualify for a mortgage for any type of property in Toronto, you basically have to be in the sort of top 10 to 15% of income. So you've got a lot of people with six-figure white collar incomes that are like, I still can't afford to live here, and it's not. uh and a lot of it is like not so much like, oh, my budget's going to be tight. It's like, no bank will give me a mortgage because I don't meet the qualification rules. So I think that's why we should care about development charges and things like that, because if they are preventing housing from being built in your city, it's meaning that you're losing the very people that your city needs to function. And we see that in not just the city of Toronto, but you're starting to see it in the 905 as well. We had a report at the institute called "Who Will Swing the Hammer," looking at this in the city of Hamilton, where we're seeing this exodus of. Yeah, it was a great pun.
Yeah, it's a
I
great title. I
can't.
love
It was my it was
it.
my it was my co-authors. I can't take credit for it, but looking at that issue, and they're seeing that in Hamilton as well, that folks are moving to Hamilton like 23, 24 years old, getting their first job, then a few years later having kids and going, you know what, I'm moving to Thorold, or I'm moving to Brantford, or places like that, just because I can't afford to live here anymore. And that's a problem right now for Hamilton, and it's only going to get worse unless we start addressing the housing crisis.
Is the solution then to be cutting development charges, or is it to be just changing the structure of the way they're doing it? Like, how do you solve it?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that you can do, and I think the important point on this is that we're not suggesting that we slash infrastructure spending. This is not like a government is the problem argument, and we're trying to starve the beast. It's more about how do we get municipalities the money that they need to build all of this infrastructure. So there's a few different plans out there. One of the candidates for Ontario Liberal leader has suggested a way to just have the province pay for it out of GST and other money,
Who's
pay
that?
for infrastructure. That's Yasser Naqvi suggesting it that way. So that's one way we can do it. the other way is finding ways to, instead of trying to pay for the infrastructure up front, debt finance it and then collect it back through, the higher water prices or sewer rates, move it more into the property tax base. So there are novel ways of doing this. And, we can look to other provinces like Quebec, for instance, that don't have all of these fees and charges, but still find a way to make their cities work.
I see having watched a lot of what's going on in Toronto City Council, I see a lot of time councillors saying things that seem to be just keep making developers pay for it. That's all you have to do. They have the money, they make a lot of money, and a lot of them are quite wealthy. And so why not just make them pay for it? So I guess I just wanted to kind of think about like what the consequences are of doing that. That it doesn't seem that simple that you can just say, just get them to pay for it, because like they're still going to want to make the same amount of money.
And these projects are either going to make economic sense or they won't. And those developers won't develop it if they don't make economic sense. And I think it's naive to kind of assume that developers are paying these fees and have no power. It's this weird kind of dichotomy where we always think about it. Well, they're greedy developers, but they're also acting as Santa Claus. That every time development charges go up, they're like, no, we got this. We won't pass this along. So it seems unreasonable. But yeah, I mean, the development charges, do they eat some of it? Yeah, probably a little, but a lot of it just gets passed on to consumers or causes things not to get built in the first place.
And I know that this kind of idea is not something that so many people talk about these days. And I'd love to hear, like, if you're listening to this and you're someone who works in development, or you're someone who studies this through in academia or watches it from any other vantage point, and you want to make the case for why it doesn't affect home prices, like, I would love to hear it. Please get in touch, and we'd love to have you on to talk about it. Thanks so much for listening and watching. This episode was produced by Meredith Martin.
And please like, subscribe, or leave a comment. It would help us out a lot.
See you next time.